especially in Southern African region. What we compare is the trend in increasing illicit drug trafficking throughout South Africa and throughout the region. And we clearly see that many drugs from different parts of the world are coming to the region, very unfortunately, creating also domestic market for consumption of different type of drugs, including heroin, including methamphetamines, synthetic drugs, including, of course, opiates and cocaine. They are easily available, and also a local domestic market of drugs. Talking about the gender-based violence, there are some studies that show that women who use drugs have a 2 to 5 times higher prevalence of gender-based violence than women who don't use drugs in the general population. While it is difficult to construct global or regional estimates of drug use among men and women, some country-specific information highlights differences in patterns of drug use among men and women. For example, women who use drugs typically begin using substances later than men. Once they have initiated substance use, women tend to increase their rate of consumption of alcohol, cannabis, cocaine, and opiates more rapidly than men. Addiction is developing much more rapidly than in male population. Another difference is that women are more likely to associate their drug use with an intimate partner, while men are more likely to use drugs with male friends. In comparison with men, women who use drugs have considerably more frequent and intense experience with interpersonal violence, sexual abuse, and trauma, including from the police and including in the prison setting. In South Africa, in 2018, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, which I represent here, organized consultations in 4 cities in South Africa, in Pretoria, Cape Town, in 3 cities in Johannesburg, to get a better understanding of the experience of women who use drugs. We organized it jointly with the NPO, the People Association of People Network of People Who Use Drugs. And what we found out through the study, and by the way, the study is called, has a self-explanatory title, which is called Whether You Were Raped or Were You Just Not Paid. That is actually a summary of experience of women who use drugs in their communication, in their interaction with the government, with the national service providers. Where they are not really taking very seriously, and where they have a secondary victimization when they're going through the relevant national services. The report also resulted, highlighted inequalities in access to health care and the disproportionate effect of HIV/AIDS on young women and women from key population groups, including women who use drugs. Women who use drugs is one of the most vulnerable population groups in the country. We do have information about the violence that they experience, and also high vulnerability and marginalization, especially during COVID-19 time, where many women were not really given any, refused to be given an access to shelters or to some treatment services. So that is, I think, one of the issues that would be very good to also highlight in our discussion about gender-based violence. Since the gender-based violence is very complex, it includes multiple forms of violence against women, including childhood sexual abuse, intimate partner violence, non-partner assault, as well as trafficking in women and their sexual exploitation. By concluding my contribution to our conversation, I would like to reiterate that United Nations stand ready to continue working with the government, with the civil society, and we are already working very actively in addressing gender-based violence. We are ready to share the evidence, research that is already available in different countries, as well as recommendations that are coming out of that research. Thank you very much for your time, and I'm happy to answer the questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was truly informative, but I think that what comes out for me is the importance of evidence-based interventions. That these interventions must come at the back of research and statistics, because in order for us to have truly effective harm reduction interventions, it must be based on an understanding of the socioeconomic and political context within which those interventions are being implemented. Now, here comes the worst part of any webinar for me, because at the same time I'm looking at the time, but also we need to engage robustly in the work. I would invite any questions that people may have. Perhaps raise your hand, or alternatively, if you don't have a question, to Dr. Remark. Apologies, I literally have to look at your name in order to pronounce it correctly, and then I have the fear that I'll pronounce it wrong in any case. So it's a convolution of anxiety. I wanted to ask a very pointed question in relation to the structural and understanding there are structural issues that need to be addressed, and also the interventions that need to happen. Oftentimes, we don't want to bring about superficial interventions. For instance, South Africa, in my mind, is very, very willing to criminalize everything. Everything must be criminalized. In your professional view, do you think a much more softer approach, having due regard to the intersecting factors that are often social as well, do you think a softer, much more harm reductive intervention might be much more effective in reducing alcohol consumption and therefore having an impact on the consistency and the severity of GBV and intimate partner violence?
So I think the two approaches along a continuum. And so on the one end of the continuum, we look at prevention. And so, that's of major concern to us, particularly when we see the very high rate of underage drinking, for example, in South Africa. And if we take a life cycle approach to both alcohol use as well as gender-based violence. So there are certainly prevention interventions that I think need to be embedded in all the different life cycle stages. And I think that those are critical in ensuring that we challenge patriarchy, we challenge this notion of masculinities and toxic masculinities, we challenge the notions of disempowerment, etc., of women. And we should be able to do that through a range of prevention interventions that have been found to be effective globally. I think that you also make a really important point about harm reduction, because harm reduction recognizes that a lot of people indeed do drink, but what we want to do is to ensure that they drink responsibly. And when I say that, I mean it very differently to, for example, the way the alcohol industry talks about responsible drinking. It's about creating the environments around people who choose to drink, and in fact it is a choice that ensures that they are safer, that the people around them are safer, that they do so in a way that takes personal responsibility but also collective responsibility. And so I would argue for both approaches that in as much as we're able to use prevention approaches to curb what we call, alcohol debut, for example, particularly among younger people, we should also be considering recognizing that we're not asking for a prohibitionist approach in South Africa to alcohol use. We recognize people who drink, but we want them to do it in a way that is that is quite responsible. I hope I've addressed your question.
Yes, yes. Thank you very much. That was a lovely contribution. I do think that oftentimes what I took from your responses, we have to do the work. We have to do the work of, understanding that it requires interventions that help us to drink responsibly, but drink responsibly in a manner that also allows us to understand the collective impact of our individual actions, right? And I do think that in terms of prevention, even getting to that point, it requires a lot of work as well. There is a question here for Ms. Akeshva. We would like to, the journalist from the SABC, Tabile Mele, would like to know the correct pronunciation of your name and surname. And it's perhaps something I should have asked in the beginning, because you will notice that I avoided saying your first name. I apologize profusely. I shouldn't really ask, because I was trying to practice in Googling pronunciations, but I couldn't really locate proper ones. So I went, in terms of the sound. Could you please provide us with a proper pronunciation of your name?
With pleasure. My name is Julduz Akeshva. I am a UNODC regional representative for Southern Africa.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. Before we go to MTD for a comment on the bylaws, Chanel Lichman from Post Newspaper would like to know what was the difference of GBV under level 5 or the lockdown when the movement was restricted and alcohol was not allowed to be sold, compared now under to level 1 of lockdown. Do any of our guests perhaps have the statistics or a proper understanding? Because I do know that there were various contradictory statistics that came. Some statistics said there was to allow drinking because there was this increase in gender-based violence and reporting of gender-based violence. And however, as we went through the lockdown, these numbers seem to gradually go down and gradually disappear. Do any of the guests have maybe proven, but a safe estimated region of the differences between the increase of GBV in level 5 versus the increase or the decrease now that we are in level 1. Whilst my guests think about that, I would like to call on, I think it's Director or Dr. MT Mqadi, who would like to comment briefly on the bylaws issue regarding liquor outlets in proximity to schools and places of worship. Dr. or Director MT Mqadi, you may comment.
Oh, thank you. I hope I'm audible. It's actually that company, but my is also just fine.
Sorry, the line is breaking.
Yes, it's very bad. Unfortunately, it's very bad. Would you perhaps move a bit? I notice people say move. I'm not sure if it's effective, but hopefully if you move slightly, it will help.
All right, can you hear me now?
Yes, you seem to be coming through clearly.
All right. I work at the South African Police Service, and part of what we do here is looking at the closure of illegal liquor outlets and also, addressing issues of compliance for those that can. And
we seem to be losing you again, Director, Doctor. Your sound is very intermittent. So you come in and out, but we can see that you're making a contribution. Is it possible for you to perhaps type in the message so that I can read out your comments? Yes.
Thank you.
In the meantime, I would like to invite any of the guests who would like to have, I will call you by name, who would like to make a brief 2-minute comment in terms of, some of the issues that have come up in relation to the multifactorial, can I characterize it, the multifactorial contribution of factors that impact on GBV and how alcohol exacerbates those factors, those underlying factors. I think that we're all in agreement that the issue of alcohol usage and its connection to GBV is one of consistency and severity, right? That in the absence, it's not to say that in the absence of alcohol, GBV does not happen. However, that alcohol does show an increase in the consistency and the severity of intimate partner violence. However, there is the dynamic where domestic violence or an inverse relationship, I think Dr. Ramsumar said, an inverse relationship where you find that women who then experience GBV or domestic violence then resort to self-medicate through the use of alcohol and substance abuse and other substance abuse as contributed by Commissioner Lindu Njobaja. I think broadly our guests we can agree that broadly our guests agree that there's a need for interventions, right? There's a need for an understanding of how we can prevent, so preventative interventions, but also harm reduction interventions. I think perhaps from my side as a listener and as a chair, what came out strongly for me is understanding that there can be interventions that are not abolitionist in effect, right? So we're not saying let's go with the Botswana model where there is very heavily restricted access to alcohol. However, there does need to be a reduction in how and when and the quantities that people access alcohol. And I think that is what the pandemic has highlighted, that access to alcohol in South Africa has produced a problem that impacts on GBV and intimate partner violence, but also it impacts broadly. I mean, I think that nobody can disagree that the level of car violence and car incidents, fatalities dropped significantly. So alcohol is a problem. How we intervene and how we give effect to these insights that have been brought by our guests will determine how then we can either successfully reduce consumption of alcohol, because I think that is the intervention that a lot of the guests are leaning towards, and therefore reducing intimate partner violence in order to address the other underlying institutional factors, such as unemployment, experiences of childhood abuse, post-traumatic disorder, mental health. Alcohol certainly doesn't help us in then addressing those underlying systematic and structural issues. I would like to call on my guests. I will start with Mr. Reverend Bafana Khumalo to just give us a brief 2-minute closing remark. If you can, Mr. Reverend, apologies, Reverend Khumalo, just if you can address the issue of whether there are any stats that indicate the increase or decrease comparatively between level 5, where there was a complete ban on alcohol access, versus level 1, but there is no pressure for you to address that.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Bafana is fine, please. I'm not into titles. The question you're asking is a very important one, particularly for us in South Africa. As we all know, stats are a major challenge. How data is collected, there are lots of gaps. And so I don't want to venture and suggest, one can give a definitive response to the question you have posed. I would rather suggest that perhaps institutions like yourselves, CGE, needs to influence government policy around how stats are collected, that they are disaggregated, so that we can get. Sorry.
Apologies. Yes, you are. Let me just mute. I've muted the participant. Apologies, Mr. Bafana. Apologies.
Yeah. So I think we need to obviously improve how we collect our data. What we know from anecdotal evidence is that during the lockdown, violent experiences increased, and that is to be expected. We have high levels of gender-based violence in this country, and as to be expected, if people who are used to perpetuating violence against women, they're in a condition where they are locked now with their partners 24/7, one can only expect that there will be an increase. But I think when there was less access to alcohol, we did receive positive feedback, at least from the health services, that the number of cases that they were dealing with that are related to trauma reduced quite substantially. And therefore one can extrapolate that, there was at least less experiences of violent episodes that led to people having to access the health services as a result of trauma. But as I say, we would need to really tease out this data so that we can get definitive responses. And when alcohol was introduced, we did indeed see a spike in violence-related sexual gender-based violence cases. And to what extent, I can't sitting here give those numbers. And as I say, I can only underscore the need for us to improve our data collection so that we are able to find all this information that will help us in programming and response to all these challenges. That's as far as I can venture on this, Chairperson. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Bafana. That is truly a very, it's very refreshing to see a person, be very honest about how statistics work. I think that it's very important for us to understand that really we can say anecdotally that yes, incidences of a particular kind of traumatic violence being reported to hospitals decreased, but in terms of whether GBV itself decreased, and it might not mean that the restriction of alcohol excess did not impact on the severity of the violence experience. So there might have been an impact, but we need statistical determination on what was the exact impact. Was the impact severity? Was the impact that there was no violence? Or were there other contributing factors that impacted on GBV within the home, but perhaps alcohol then didn't add that extra layer of the consistency and severity of it. Thank you very much. I'd like to call on Dr. Remark to make some closing comments. Doctor, you're still muted, sorry.
Thank you and apologies. Just echoing what Bafana had to say about really just having to rely on anecdotal evidence in relation to your question about whether we know that there was an increase or a decrease. The available evidence that we do have comes from the crime stats report by Minister Kwele. and that actually reported a decrease in domestic violence. But I do want to add the caveat to that, that those numbers are only in relation to people who have reported any sort of domestic violence. And so, given the nature of COVID and the COVID lockdown, I think that the number of people who are just not able to access services or access. I think there's a critical bit of work that needs to be done post some of the COVID restrictions, looking at alcohol-related violence and how some of the measures taken by government functioned to impact on that. Just to make some closing comments, I want to say that it's very important that we recognize that alcohol as a South African phenomenon, a global phenomenon, but as well as gender-based violence, existed and were major public health problems long before COVID arrived. And I think that we mustn't lose focus in our intervention, in our policy efforts, in our science, etc., around working on ways to address those two problems. And so, long after COVID has left us, which we all hope will be very, very soon, these will remain prevailing public health problems. And so I think we need to recognize that the evidence is there. We need to ensure that our decision making is couched in that evidence. And also to maximize on the opportunities that COVID has given us, which is to really have a natural experiment. We saw a natural experiment in level 5, where a whole range of very strict measures were implemented, and we immediately saw a drop in trauma and emergency room cases. And so I think that all of that historical evidence, as well as the data from the natural experiments that we have, should be taken very seriously in order to inform decision making around these two public health problems going forward.
Thank you so very much. I think that it's very important. I am deeply grateful for the framing it as a public health issue. I think rarely in South Africa do we characterize societal issues, whether it's substance abuse or alcohol abuse or domestic, as a public health issue requiring public health interventions, not necessarily criminalization or further criminalizing the issue and bringing it further underground. I'd like to call on Commissioner Ntuli Gobata to provide us with some closing remarks on the session.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Day. I think as a country, we should not overlook the power of conducting public awarenesses and educational campaign on the topics that we are talking about. And also our government in general, and also including our if they can approach a very stern approach in dealing with alcohol abuse in an event where there is a need to withdraw a license of a particular trader. I think we need to be vigilant in making sure that does happen. And also for CGE, we don't condone any form of abuse. Hence, we also have a research unit that does research as and when we feel there is a gap that needs to be addressed. And the other thing that I wanted to say in closing, also the issue of culture, how we handle our ceremonies. For an example, the introduction of alcohol. We also need to look into that particular aspect, because you find a situation whereby when certain ceremonies are being done, if a young man or a young woman is not found being drinking, they regard that person as less of a man. So those are the things also we need to look at. And I agree with the speakers that were emphasizing a lot on the importance of evidence-based research and also on statistical information in dealing with this particular approach. We just need to tackle all incidences of alcohol abuse, incidences of gender-based violence, significantly. And by us doing that, we will reduce the risk of domestic violence and increase the level of safety for everybody, but women in particular. Thank you very much, Commissioner Day.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Ndulito. But I'd like to call lastly on Ms. Kishva to provide us with some final comments before we close the session.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. My comments are really rather brief. First of all, I would like just to commend the commitment of South African government. If you hear the debate and the discussion and the work that is being done with the civil society organizations, engagement by all, like ordinary citizens, mass media, president himself, research institution, it's really commendable. What I would like just to summarize, you already came up with very solid recommendations. But what is very important, and I would like to agree with the previous speakers, that all the policies and strategies that you are developing now in addressing the gender-based violence and also the issue of substance abuse as related to the violence should be evidence-based, right? And all colleagues who were presenting today, they were saying how important it is to really have a data analysis, research-based intervention. It has a very direct cost implications because with all the expenditures that are invested now into the gender-based violence work, they need to be concentrated on the only evidence-based intervention. The second point that I wanted to make is I think we really need to try to overcome the silo approach, right? And take this issue as a complex issue. It's not an easy issue. You cannot just address it through the prohibition or through the awareness raising. You can address it only in a very complex manner when several agencies are working together with civil society organizations and being accountable for delivering very specific results. This interagency approach should be based on a comprehensive strategy, right? Talking about prevention, especially among young people, so that this substance abuse, unresponsible drinking is not embedded in the youth culture. We need to support the culturally appropriate environment at the community level that would support the healthy growth of youth. Crime prevention measures at the community level. We need to talk about the treatment. What services are actually available for people who are misusing drugs or misusing alcohol, right? How do we treat them that they will not fall again into the same pattern of violent behavior? And of course, the issue of protection. Of course, I do agree with the moderators that there is no need to criminalize everything. But I think the perpetrators need to be brought to justice. So overall, I believe if we manage together to pursue the integrated approach based on the evidence, we will succeed. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. This has been a really great webinar for me because I think I was part of the people that Dr. Ramsunar, who was very skeptical about this constant, connections being made to alcohol. And I'd rather am a staunch feminist who believes that, patriarchy is the root of all problems. But I think that for me, perhaps, it's understanding the intersectional nature and how alcohol is but an aggravating contributor to the severity and instances of GBV and IPV, but perhaps the pandemic is a moment for us to begin to really reassess the structural and systemic inequalities that also underlie the emergence and the persistence and foster GBV and intimate partner violence. I want to thank our guests. I want to say thank you very much for your contributions, and I have written down a mini report here that I hope that the CGE, as the CGE, will really take us in deepening some of our work in the area of GBV. Part of the reasoning that brought about this webinar was us not wanting to have a knee-jerk reaction to the increase in GBV. We wanted to understand the systemic and the structural issues that were impacting the increase and exacerbating the increase, particularly during the COVID pandemic period, but also understanding and giving us a sense of what is happening. How do we then go back to our research unit and say we need interventions that are focused on prevention, that are focused on harm reduction, but also what do we then take to Parliament as part of our mandate as the CGE, as part of it, we have a legislative advisory capacity that we can then go to Parliament and say these are some of the ways in which we've assessed and seen that GBV needs to be curtailed. I love the emphasis that this is not about, proposing an abolitionist perspective, but understanding that part of taking alcohol abuse and alcohol use as a public health concern means that we must center women in our solutions as well. With that, I'd like to read Director Mqadi's contribution. You would have noted a little bit earlier on they were unable to properly give their comment, and they say in the course of compliance enforcement, it was brought to our notice, they are part of the SAPS, that there are licensed liquor outlets that were established before some schools or churches were established, close to the tavern or bottle store, etc. The SAPS has engaged the Department of Trade and Industry responsible for licensing of liquor outlets, and SALGA, the municipalities body, and has requested that these matters be addressed. It is a complex matter that may require revision of enabling national legislation as proposed by Reverend Kumalo. I think that is also, buttresses the emphasis of the legacy of urban planning and spatial planning. We haven't addressed segregated spatial planning in South Africa, and I think that part of the multifocal interventions is also looking at urban planning and how it structures our communities to form healthy community building habits. With that, I would like to thank our lovely guests and distinguished guests. I would like to also thank the CGE, of which I'm a part of. I'd like to thank the media for being part of this webinar, and I would like to thank everybody who has contributed and wanted to really make an impact through this webinar. And I hope that you will hold us accountable as the CGE to produce tangible intervention on this webinar, because this is part of the work that we're trying to really ground our work in and ensure that once the pandemic is over, that we have evidence-based resources and we can look to institutions and organizations that can help us and enable us to properly give informed advice, particularly within our constitutional mandate. Thank you, everybody, and with that, I would like to close the webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you to Chair.
The male children, and it's very important that we do bring in oftentimes how GBV and intimate partner violence is framed
is often as a woman problem, right? And I love how you're bringing in the issue of how patriarchy impacts and fashions men's masculinity or conceptions of masculinity, and how that then plays itself out within their broader social and community interactions. Thank you very much for that contribution, Mr. Bafana Khumalo. I would like to call on next on Dr.
Consumes is associated with an increase in the high levels of alcohol use.
Economic cost of violence and the proportional violence related
agreement.
We really need to try to overcome the silo approach, right? And take this issue as a complex issue. It's not an easy issue. You cannot just address it through the prohibition or through the awareness raising. You can address that only in a very complex manner. When several agencies are working together with civil society organizations and being accountable for delivering very specific results. This interagency approach should be based on a comprehensive strategy, right? Talking about prevention, especially among young people, so that this substance abuse, unresponsible drinking is not embedded in the youth culture. We need to support the culturally appropriate environment at the community level that would support the healthy growth of youth